So come on in and have a seat, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Environmental Forum of Marin's lecture series. I'm falling apart here. My name is Ann Bauer, and I am going to turn over the welcome to Dan Monty, who is a master class Marin Environmental Forum, or Environmental Forum of Marin master class graduate, and the gentleman who put it together. And then I'll switch back over.
Well, I didn't put it together by myself, that's for sure. And I want to thank the Presbyterian Church for allowing us to use the space. I moved back to San Rafael about 8 years ago, and I began working with environmental groups. And I learned that folks can have a real strong commitment to the natural world and preserving it and protecting it, and still different on issues. And I think we're going to talk about something tonight that's going to manifest that. I want to thank the Environmental Forum for providing the opportunity to put this on. When I asked Ann Bauer if the forum would be interested in doing this event, she said, sure, go ahead and do it. So, and then I have to thank Judy Schriedman from the Gallinas Watershed Council, and seemingly everything else in water related around Marin, to Carrie Stabner from the Marin Water Coalition, and to Frank Eggert. Frank's group, the North Coast Rivers Alliance, with the others, won a lawsuit last year contesting the environmental impacts of the Delta Plan, which I think is integral to what's going on tonight. I also want to thank John Hart, the author, a past presenter on forum lectures on water, and my neighbor, and all four of them, without any of them, I would not have been able to put this on. They helped me find people to present tonight, and we have a great panel, and I'm really excited about that. So enjoy. I know I'm going to learn a lot, and don't forget that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. Okay.
So I just want to remind you that this is the Environmental Forum of Marin's lecture series. We have two programs with the Environmental Forum of Marin. The first is the Master Class, which is a series of seminars and field trips to prepare and enrich you to engage in environmental issues and advocate and educate. So it is a preparatory for you and the issues that you are deeply passionate about. It runs from August to November. Weekly is the training. And they are on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and it also involves a project that you kind of work on throughout. Could be something you're already working on. And then in May is the graduation. So we are looking towards our master class, is it 44? No, 43. 43, okay. Graduating here shortly in May. And the woman who raised her hand over there, that's Norma, who is our master class director. And actually, if you have questions about the master class, please go to Norma and any of the board members. Why don't we take a hand right now and have board members raise their hand, and then any of the people that were helping you out front, but if you have class questions about the forum. So our lecture series is our second program. It runs from January to April. It's open to the public. It brings timely, current information on environmental issues of interest locally, and but some big picture too. And the lectures are open to the public. You don't have to be a member of the forum. You don't have to be involved in the master class, and you don't have to read this, but no, you can become a member of the forum. And depending on what level, you could be coming to these lectures for free and supporting our work, educating your peers and educating yourself by participating in our lecture series. So without further ado, I am turning this over to David Kuhnhart. David Kuhnhart is our vice president of the forum, and he's going to be introducing the speakers. And the next slide
is
the agenda. So,
okay, everybody can focus on the agenda. Welcome, advocates. It is customary for the forum to try to recognize those people who spend their days and weeks serving in the public interest. And I see Maureen Pardon, put your hand up, who is aide to Supervisor Sears, who is a passionate advocate in environment, sea level rise, and climate change issues. So if you want to talk with somebody in the county governance on those topics, here we are. Also, Cal Weeks, would you stand up actually, Cal? Cal is aide to our Assemblyman Mark Levine from the AD10 district, and one of his specialties, because our assembly member, one of his assignments is water quality and natural resources. It would be, he is delighted to be here, I know, that's what he told me, and it would be terrific if any one of you went and held on to his buttonhole and gave him your side of things. He's eager to hear all the different perspectives. Are there any public officials that, I know there are lots of volunteers in lots of communities, Fairfax. Judy, what is your role?
Las Gallinas Sanitary District.
Las Gallinas.
Sanitation, I can tell you the water gets pretty funky.
Water does get funky, and they are advocates of turning that canal into a stream again, which is a movement across the country. Any other public officials that I might have missed? Let's just go straight into speakers. Peter, would you come up, please? Peter Drekmeier. He's worked with the Tuolumne River Trust since 2007. He currently serves as its policy director. He is a powerful advocate, and he runs advocacy programs aimed at protecting and preserving the entire Tuolumne. He is also a former mayor of Palo Alto and, fortunately, a whitewater rafting expert, because he has the greatest number of slides, and he's going to show us how to dash through very quickly 57 slides as he would in a class 4 rapids. So go.
All right, jump right in. Happy International Women's Day, everybody. Great to see you out here. And actually, the panel originally was all women, but they're participating in the Day Without Women, so we're just fill-ins. So thank you. Really want to thank the Environmental Forum of Marin for including me. So I'm going to talk about the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. How many people here have heard about that? Well, quite a few. Okay, it's a pretty well-kept secret. We're trying to make it less of a secret. We're trying to engage people. We think of this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to revive the Bay Delta and its tributaries. And let's see. There we go. Okay, so I think a lot of people are familiar with the Bay Delta. It's the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. Half of the precipitation that falls on California drains out from the north, the Sacramento River Basin, from the south, the San Joaquin River Basin. And about 2/3 of Californians get at least a portion of their water from the Delta. It provides incredible biological diversity. Over 500 species depend on the Bay Delta. It's a migration path for steelhead, salmon, sturgeon, and other anadromous fish. And I think it's very fitting that St. Francis, or San Francisco, is the patron saint of animals and ecology. So San Francisco Bay is our Garden of Eden, very special place. A major stopover for the Pacific Flyway. And historically, we had more than 1 million salmon, some years quite a bit more than 1 million salmon spawning in Central Valley rivers. So a lot of times it gets boiled down to salmon. And what I like to point out is it's really about a salmon-based ecosystem. Salmon, there are more than 100 species that depend on salmon. They bring tremendous amounts of nutrients from the ocean to upland habitats where a female will lay about 5,000 eggs, and only about 2 will survive to become reproducing adults. So most of the eggs, the juveniles, the mature fish are fueling the food web. And they're just a remarkable species, an incredible gift. Humans historically have been very dependent on salmon. Native peoples were consumed about 8.5 million pounds per year. And it's also been a very important part of our history, from the gold rush to current days, and you'll hear more about the commercial salmon fishery from John McManus. So agriculture in the 1800s started changing the Bay Delta ecosystem and the rivers that feed it. Levees were put in to create farmland, so we didn't have those floodplains anymore, and water started getting diverted from the upstream rivers. And over the years, more and more water was taken out of the delta or upstream directly from the rivers. On the San Joaquin, on average, only about a third of the natural flow makes it to the delta. Some years, it's only about 10%. So San Joaquin's been hit really hard. 2015 was a pretty dry year and extremely dry for the fish in the ecosystem. You can see just the bare amount of water coming down the river. There's a great report out by the Bay Institute. I'm sure Greg will refer to it. He brought a copy. It talks about the freshwater starved estuary, the Bay Delta. And on average, only about 50% of the freshwater flow makes it to the bay. Some years it's as low as a third. So that's changed the salinity balance and affects everything from plankton up to marine mammals. You probably heard about these toxic algae blooms in the delta. Water gets warmer, more stagnant. This cyanobacteria thrives, produces toxic neurotoxins, and can kill plankton, other wildlife, make people sick. So people are starting to pay attention. And you'll hear from a lot of water agencies that, well, it's a lot of other factors. It's not flow that's the issue, but flow impacts so many other issues related to fish and wildlife. Water temperature, dissolved oxygen, water quality, ability to migrate in and out from the rivers to the ocean, floodplain inundation, which is critical habitat for juvenile salmon and other fish. So it's really the major factor. What we've done is we've altered the ecosystem so much, from fast-moving cold rivers to slow-moving warm rivers, that favor species that evolved elsewhere in those conditions. So this is water hyacinth, not native to the United States, and it was just clogging the Tuolumne and San Joaquin rivers, especially during the drought. Got fleshed out a lot this year, so that's nice. But we're seeing a lot of invasive species are getting a foothold into the river system. And water quality, temperature is a big one, but also you have things like sewage and pesticides and fertilizers and heavy metals making it into the rivers. More water helps dilute that. The mature salmon need to come up from the ocean to spawn, and probably more important is fleshing out the juvenile salmon in the spring, making sure that they can get out to the delta and the ocean. So there's a direct correlation between flows and salmon returning from the ocean. What we found on the Tuolumne is when there's a big water year, 2.5 years later, we get a peak. We had 40,000 in 1985, we had 18,000 in 2000. A year ago, we had less than 500. So for the first time ever, the commercial fishing season had to be canceled in 2008, 2009. It cost 2,200 jobs and $250 million in revenue. So here we are talking about the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. This was required by the Clean Water Act. The first plan was in 1978. It was updated in 1995, and we really haven't had any substantial updates since then. So it's been more than 20 years. It's supposed to be updated every 3 years. And this is something that is overseen by the State Water Resources Control Board. So it's different than the twin tunnels. You'll hear about that from the other speakers. The California Water Fix, which includes the tunnels, used to be called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. So whenever we mention Bay Delta, it's like, oh, the twin tunnels. This is really about unimpaired in-stream flows versus infrastructure. So the Delta is in really serious trouble, and this plan back in 2009 was the Delta Reform Act, directing the Water Board to proceed with updating the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And phase one focuses on the San Joaquin Basin with the co-equal goals of ensuring reliable water supply and restoring the environment. So it will establish unimpaired flows on the three main tributaries to the lower San Joaquin, the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, and the Merced. And currently, you can see the averages at the bottom, just a fraction, from 1/5 to 40% of the fresh flow is making it down to the San Joaquin. So there was a study, a flow criteria report that the Water Board issued in 2010, and they found that For the San Joaquin, we would need 60% of unimpaired flow to fully protect fish species. It wasn't a recommendation because it acknowledged there are other beneficial uses, agriculture, urban uses, but 60% is what the science tells us would really be needed if we wanted to restore the fishery. What the plan, which was released September 15th, calls for 40% of unimpaired flow between February and June. Those are critical out-migration time, rearing and out-migration time for juvenile salmon. So you see it would be an improvement. It's not the 60% that the fish would like to see, but a bit of an improvement. And it has some flexibility in it. It could be, the idea is to establish goals and objectives. If they can be met with less water, it could go as low as 30%, or if they're not met, it could go as high as 50%. So you'd think that the water agencies that think, hey, we need to control predators or create habitat, you'd think if they were really honest about that they would like this approach. But the bottom line is they don't want to give up any more water. So the key is water use efficiency. We've shown we can make tremendous progress in the San Francisco PUC service territory, which is San Francisco, San Mateo, part of Santa Clara and Alameda counties. We reduced our water use by 30% over the last 10 years. We have the Silicon Valley Water Conservation Awards coming up on March 22nd. It's in Palo Alto. It's a bit of a trek, but there's some really wonderful things happening. We recognize those and encourage others. So if you want to learn more, the website's waterawards.org. So agriculture, 80% of the developed water, the water that's taken out of the rivers, is used for agriculture, so 20% for urban uses. And there's a lot of room for improvement. Agricultural irrigation efficiency, shifting from really water-intensive crops like alfalfa to higher value, lower water use crops. The South San Joaquin Water District, they did a pilot project and they switched to pressurized water that allows drip, and they saw a 30% improvement in efficiency and a 30% improvement in production. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Exports are a real issue. In California, water is a public trust resource. It belongs to the people. You could argue that growing food for Californians is a good use of that resource, but when you're exporting crops like almonds and other nuts, there's an agribusiness usually that's benefiting, and the people are not getting their share of the benefit. And so that's something I think we need to look at. A lot of opposition in the Central Valley to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. They're very dependent on cheap water, and they don't want to give up any. Unfortunately, there's also opposition from the San Francisco PUC. They put out these erroneous numbers early on. 188,000 jobs could be lost and $49 billion in sales. And there were a number of flaws with their study. I need to keep moving. I got my 5-minute mark, so I'm sorry to race through this. But we know that we just did 30% rationing, and according to their socioeconomic study, we should have seen probably somewhere between $6.5 billion and $10 billion in lost revenues last year. That didn't happen. They did a couple of different studies. You can see the $49 billion from their 2009 study. And we should have seen at least 25,000 jobs lost last year. We didn't, and in fact, a lot of jobs were added during the drought. So there's a lot of misinformation out there that we've been battling. The San Francisco PUC has a lot of storage, reservoirs in the Sierra, on the Tuolumne, but also in the Bay Area. And this shows the different water years. The initial water coming down the river belongs to the irrigation district because they have senior water rights. But then additional water belongs to the SFPUC, and they capture that. So you can see in drought years, there's a lot less water, but in a normal year, they can capture about 3 times as much water from the Tuolumne as they use. And so they have something called a water bank. Don't really have time to explain it, but that dropped quite a bit during the drought, but you can see the reservoir stayed pretty full. And even at the height of the drought, we still had enough water in storage to last 3 years. So storage is a really critical component of the program. In December, before all these rains in January, we were up to we had enough water in storage to last 5 years. And that was just after one normal year, the year before. And of course, now the whole system's full. They had to release water. So here's the problem with holding back water. 2002 was a pretty dry year. The fish didn't really see very much of that water. 2003, again, not much water for the fish. 2004, not a little bit more. And then 2005, we had a pretty good water year, and a lot of water was released. And then 2006, a lot of water released to prevent flooding. That water would have been much better used over the course of those other years. And then you have a normal year or a big year, and the whole system fills, and it erases any deficit. So I think this is my last slide, so pretty good timing. We modeled what would happen if SFPUC water demand rebounded to where it was before the drought, and that with the 40% unimpaired flow from the Bay Delta plan, and assuming that more than half of the increase in releases would be the responsibility of San Francisco PUC. And we found that they could survive every drought on record. So the 6-year drought of record in 87-92, we could survive that. But what they model is an 8-year design drought. So it's that 6-year drought plus the 76-77 drought. And so that gets them into a little bit of trouble. There are a lot of opportunities to, still with conservation and recycled water, but also with groundwater recharge in the Central Valley. And creating, by helping to fund that, they wouldn't have access to that water, but they could trade off of it. And they could capture more water in Hetch-Hetchy than they would otherwise be entitled to because of their junior water rights. So those are some of the things we're promoting. So, there's a lot of flawed information that decision makers and others have been receiving, and we've been trying to counter that. The storage provides a really great buffer from shortages. And bottom line is we can improve the ecosystem and maintain a strong economy. We've proven that. The economy's grown. We use a lot less water, and there's even more room for more potential for improvement. So these are the 5 water board members. Written comments are due next Friday, March 17th. I've got a fact sheet back there if you want to take one. It's got all the letter writing information. Some of the fact sheets are a little bit old, and they say January 17th, which was an old date, but March 17th is the deadline. I also have a petition if you want to sign that, and would love to get people on our email list if you want to be involved. The people power is really making a big difference. So that's it for getting the Q&A card. So I feel like I crammed in a lot of information there, but it gives you a general sense that we have some opportunities here and challenges.
Let's do this. We are definitely going to have a panel at the end when we will start with speakers getting a chance to ask one another questions. And yet, we thought if there's specific things that he did not cover well, or that are just a burning question for him right now, let's go at 1 or 2 of those. There's one.
Very quick, what is PUC? What does that stand for?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So they own and operate Hetch-Hetchy, and they provide water not just to San Francisco, but to a lot of people on the peninsula and even into Alameda County. So 2.6 million people get their water from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission.
Good. Kiki?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Peter. You mentioned that there's 5 years worth of storage in the reservoir, and your slide actually said 6. But I'm wondering, was that calculated based on the 20% reduction, or is that calculated on basic volumes?
So we had 5 years worth in storage in December, before January. In January, the system filled as much as it could without creating a lot of flood concerns. And they've been releasing the maximum amount they can since January. So it's about 9,000 cubic feet per second. So the Tuolumne is really flowing. At one point, we had a little bit of flooding there. So what they're trying to do is evacuate the reservoirs because we still have a big snowpack. And so there's 6 years in storage, and that would be including the Bay Delta plan at 40% unimpaired flow between February and June.
And also the 20% mandated drought restriction on water use in the city?
Yes, so the formula is they don't want to force people to conserve more than 20%. So in the first year of their 8-year drought, there would be no rationing because you don't know you're in a drought yet. Second year, no rationing. Third year, 10%, fourth, 10%, and then 20% after that. Yeah, so that we calculated all that in. Of course, we did 30% last year, so we know we could do more, but we used their conservative figures.
Nona Dennis gets the last question.
No, yeah, okay. One. I've never known how much of the flowing actually flows into the delta, how much of it is diverted over the delta.
So about 20% reaches the San Joaquin River, and of the water that's diverted, it's close to half is taken out of the river by the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts, about 14% by the San Francisco PUC. And then you have some of the water, maybe 10 or 15%, is recharging groundwater, which is overpumped. So, you can consider that an indirect diversion.
Only 14% goes to.
Right. SFPUC.
And that's domestic water for San Francisco.
That's domestic water,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
John, would you come up? Our next speaker is John McManus, who has really quite an extraordinary set of tributaries of his life flow that have brought him here. And it's nearly a lifelong love of salmon. As a fisherman, as an advocate. For 11 years, he was doing publicity and organizing for the public interest environmental law firm Earth Justice. You know Earth Justice because the earth needs a good lawyer, right? For 15 years, he produced news stories for CNN. And for almost the whole time from his childhood, late childhood, he's been a fisherman, both a recreational and a professional fisherman of salmon, and he's now executive director of the Golden Gate Salmon Association. John.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, good. Good evening, folks. It's great to be here with you tonight. Very special thanks to Dan Monty and Bauer for their efforts in putting this together. I am the executive director these days of Golden Gate Salmon Association. We are a coalition representing sport and commercial salmon fishermen and women and related businesses. And we also work very closely with conservation groups, including Earth Justice and NRDC, Trout Unlimited, Defenders of Wildlife, and a bunch of others. I want to thank Peter for the initial presentation and getting everybody oriented, I hope. A little bit of geography here. You can see, I have a pointer here. Let's see if it works. Great. Okay, Sacramento River. Here's Sacramento up here. Here's Stockton. Down here, this is around Tracy. And Byron, right down in here. Highway 205 is somewhere over there. Well, you can see 580 right there's Tracy. Sorry. So we've got state and federal pumps down there. That's the South Delta. And what you're looking at here is a map. Those small fish indicate juvenile salmon trying to come down out of the Sacramento Valley and make their way out to the ocean. These big fish represent predator fish that live in the interior delta. All that water hyacinth that Peter showed, these fish are living underneath it, by and large. So, in nature, when the Sacramento River is flowing as it should, down it comes and out to the ocean. These little dinky salmon, 2, 3, 4 inches long, they're really poor swimmers. They evolved in nature to hitchhike on runoff in the springtime. So they wait for all that runoff, they let go of the edge habitat where they're holding, they jump out in the middle, and they grab a ride on down. And if everything's working right, they'll bypass that interior delta with all those nasty big predator fish that want to eat them, and out to the ocean they go. However, if my slide, pointing the wrong way. Okay, so turn the pumps on. Turn the pumps on. Let's send some water down to the San Joaquin Valley and down to Southern California, and look what happens to the migratory path of these fish. Instead of going out to the delta, they get pulled into the interior delta where those predators are, and they're lost. I think the National Marine Fisheries Service estimates something on the order of 70 to 90% that are pulled off their natural migratory path are lost. So, do we have a good system for capturing and pumping water south? As far as salmon is concerned, the answer is no. Could we do better? Probably. Well, let's keep going, because we're going to be talking about the twin tunnels as a possible option. By the way, when they get sucked into the pumps in the delta, they try and salvage them. This is what it looks like. Most of them die. The process they have for getting them back out and releasing them, they put them in tanker trucks. They drive a few miles away and they dump them into these locations that are just plugged to the gills with predator fish. They really make very little effort to ensure survival at this point. Okay, so this line here shows you the proposed tunnel. They would take in water up here. This is just south of Sacramento. This is around Freeport, Clarksburg, right in that area. So that's where the intakes would be. And they'd run this down the twin tunnels down to the existing pumps. So in theory, would that relieve us from that humongous suction that goes on by the pumps that pulls those baby fish off their migratory path? Theoretically, it could. So what's wrong with this? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so the twin tunnels they want to build are 40 feet in diameter. And full disclosure here, this is 57.5 feet. This is up in Seattle underground. But it gives you an idea. Okay, so cut 17 feet off the diameter of that thing. You still have one humongous pipe. Gigantic. They want to do 2 of these. You think you could get the whole Sacramento River in that thing? Most times of the year, you'd be right. You know, January and February of this year, no, you probably couldn't get it all in both tunnels. But most times of the year, you sure could. In case that's not convincing, I added one more. I mean, okay, it's 40 foot instead of 57.5, but you get the idea. So our beef is why? And they say to us, listen, we have a valve on the intakes. Trust us. If the fish are in danger, we'll crank the valve down and only take enough water so it doesn't harm the fish. So who is it that's telling us to trust them? It's the guys that operate this, that Shasta Dam, operated by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the guys that operate this. This is the Klamath Water Project. This is actually up in south central Oregon near Klamath Falls. That's one of the Klamath Lakes. I don't know if it's probably lower Klamath Lake. So the Bureau of Reclamation actually, in concert with the California Department of Water Resources, as I understand it, would operate the gigantic twin tunnel projects. And they're telling us, don't worry about the size. We've got a valve. You can trust our hand on it. Okay, well, let's take a look at how they're doing on the trust factor. September 2015, feds scrambled to avoid another mass salmon die-off in the Sacramento River. This is our friends, the Bureau of Reclamation. A year ago, California lost nearly an entire generation, in 2014, mind you, of endangered salmon. Thousands of salmon eggs and newly hatched fry baked to death in a narrow stretch of the Sacramento River near Redding. Larry Collins, commercial fisherman, said, if you've got money, you can buy anything, you can buy extinction. So when push came to shove in the middle of the drought, the guys with their hand on the valve who promised us they wouldn't cook the fish, cooked them. 2 years in a row, folks, 2014 and 2015. This is winter run, protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Wasn't supposed to happen. October 2015, second year, huge numbers of juvenile winter run appear to have baked to death. Thanks, guys, with your hands on the valve. We really trust you. If that's not enough, remember, they're also running the Klamath Project. So we got word a couple weeks ago that we have extremely low numbers of Klamath fish expected to come back this year. Really low number came back last year, too. Same reason, drought. Drought, push comes to shove. When push comes to shove, can we control the guys with their hands on the valve? The answer is no. Things are looking especially bad for salmon returning to the Klamath River and its tributaries. We're looking at essentially an all-time low in the forecast for Klamath salmon this year. This gives you a little idea of how much water they were taking. You'll notice it peaked around 2003 to 2007. In 2009, a new set of federal regulations went into place which restricted the pumping, and the folks south of the Delta have been very upset ever since. They're trying to get back to the 2003-2007 level, which is one of the reasons they want twin tunnels that are gigantic. Meanwhile, what's happened to our salmon? You can see from '03, when they started to pump hard, it just fell right off a cliff. As Peter pointed out, we were shut down to fishing in '08 and '09 down at the bottom. We got those federal protections and we started to climb back up, and we hit drought. We're on our way back down, but we are in better shape than we were back in the early 2000s. Here's another graph. The blue line shows water diversions from the delta. You can see they jumped way up around 2000, 2001. You can see what it did to the salmon population, the line in red. Salmon aren't the only thing that are suffering. All kinds of native fish throughout the delta are taking a nosedive. You can see those higher numbers, they all crashed towards the end. And 2014 was the cutoff date for this graphic. Peter, you stole some of my thunder. You would think you could walk on that, maybe play football on it. You'd be wrong. You would sink right in. This is an invasive species because they have choked the life out of the delta by strangling these rivers with so many diversions. Again, you've seen this before. Okay, I'll keep going. So, again, why do we need two 40-foot tunnels? I concede the point that the existing... I thought I muted that. Sorry. My buddy Tom Moore calling from Maui, probably telling me the surf's good. So this gives you an idea of what they're after. If you look at these bars over on the right-hand side, the top of that, where they want to get up above 4.7 million acre feet of exports, they want to get back up into that 5 million acre feet, even bumping back up to 6 million acre feet like the good old days of 2000 to 2006, when they set 3 all-time high pumping records. That's what led us to sit on the beach in 2008 and 2009. We couldn't fish salmon because they hit record high diversions in the early 2000s, and they want to go back there again. I just want to say a couple words about levee failures because you're going to hear a little bit more about this this evening. So we get a big flood like we just had in January and February. It's putting a tremendous stress on the levees. There's no doubt about it. So a couple things you can do. This is a picture of the Yolo bypass. This might just look like a bunch of muddy water. To me, this looks like something really cool. It's actually nature doing what nature was supposed to do. When the river overflows its banks, if there is low-lying floodplain for it to get out onto, it will. And when it does, in the case of the Yolo bypass, it takes a tremendous amount of pressure off the levees. We've got more capacity in the Central Valley to do some more of this work. It's tremendous habitat for baby fish. All around those trees, it's plugged to the gills, I would bet you, I can't prove it, with 3-inch salmon that are eating their hearts out and growing really big and strong, and they will survive at super high rates. Here's another shot. You may recognize this. Here's the Yolo Causeway going into downtown Sacramento. Some people have driven over it over the last few months. It's really a sight to behold. It's like Lake Michigan in the middle of the Central Valley. And it's a floodplain. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's raising fish, taking pressure off levees. It's a great thing. Couple of other things I just want to hit real quick. The intakes for this monstrosity of twin tunnel thing that they want to do would look something like this. This is from their plan. And you'll notice that that section of river looks pretty straight. They've never built intakes this big before, but they've gotten close here. This is the Glen Colusa Irrigation District's intake on the upper Sacramento. Now, notice where it says fish screens and pumping station. Do you notice there's a curve in the river? That's not by accident. It's because when you put that curve in, the water will speed up. So the bypass flows past the fish screen are quicker than they would be out in the straight part of the Sacramento River, and that's important. I'm going to go back if I can. When this thing was proposed, the guys who worked on GCID wrote comments and they said, no bueno, because that's in a straight part of the river, you will pull fish in and bump them off that screen and you will kill them. So, another problem with the twin tunnels that not too many people have talked about. I am at the end. This guy's name was O'Reilly. I'm a McManus. We saw this rainbow and we figured we better check it out. I'm in the yellow thing there. And we found a fish, so we saved him. And I will leave it there. Stay there. I'm staying here.
similar rules after he turns off his phone.
Now it's turned off.
Does anybody have burning questions for John? You can pass if you want to, and we can pick it up when everybody else comes back. While you're sitting down, think of the answer to this question. How much rain are we going to get next year?
I'll have it dialed in by panel time.
Dr. Gerald Meral. Jerry Meral, would you come up, please? From I would say, a different tide. Oh, good, thank you. From a different tide of intellectual path, another extraordinary citizen. Jerry represents the Natural Heritage Institute on California water issues and water quality. He spent 20 years in charge of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. I'm sorry, he worked on the Bay Delta. It seemed like 20 years, but 20 years as executive director of the Planning and Conservation League, a California statewide conservation group, and then went on to serve the state. He served as deputy secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, and he has been in the middle of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan steering committee on and off, and brings extraordinary experience. Jerry, it's all yours.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. It's nice to be here in Marin. What the heck? I live in Marin. I live in Inverness and almost didn't get here tonight because of that, but fortunately Lucas Valley was working. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Delta in the context of what its importance is to the state, and not so much to Marin. As reliant as we are here in Marin on imported water supplies, especially from the Russian River, we don't normally take water from the Delta or any of its tributaries, but we did in 1977. If you remember that, we had the pipe over the bridge. So we do have an occasional connection to the Delta, but pretty rarely. And just a quick refresher of water, and you've heard a little bit of this already. I can find this button here. So most of the water is in the north, that's where it falls, 56 million acre feet. And most of the demand is in the south where it's much drier. And so these little people represent demand on the water supply. And of course, most of them are in Southern California, the Central Valley, or in the Bay Area. And so we have a disparity of water supply and water demand. To solve that problem, we spent the last 100 years basically developing our water supply in a way that's been very harmful to the environment and very helpful to the economy. Those are not always in sync. So we built major dams like Shasta, you saw a picture of that, Oroville, we can talk about that for a moment, Folsom, others, and then an incredible series of long aqueducts, canals, pipelines, and so on, both going east to west and also north to south. And so we've created an incredible infrastructure of 1,200 dams and countless thousands of miles of canals and aqueducts to distribute that water. And it's been very devastating for the environment. Every major stream in the Central Valley has a big dam on it and blocked most of the salmon runs that John was talking about. So here's the Delta. And let's talk about the Delta a little bit. You've seen a few pictures of this already. The Sacramento River coming down into the Delta, the San Joaquin River coming up. And it all seems like a very long-term ecological system, and it has been for a while. But the Delta is about 9,000 years old. It was formed at the end of the last ice age. Before that, the rivers flowed directly into the sea, and when we had the ice age, of course, they discharged into the Pacific Ocean out near the Farallones. You could have walked to the Farallones during the last ice age. And so the Delta is simply an accumulation of minerals that came down, settled in this sort of relatively flat area, and built up peat soils. And most of these soils in the Delta are peat, or at least they were, and those are biologically originated. So tules would grow, decompose, and the soils built up. And a lot of the organic soils, the tule soils, were 60, 70 feet deep. And they built up on that old base where the river used to flow during the Ice Age up to the modern level. So the Delta is a very unique ecosystem, of course. You heard about that from Peter. But very unique geologically, and that's the problem. Essentially, that's the problem. Oop, a little too fast. So the Delta, as Peter mentioned, is the source of water for most of the people in the state to some extent. And so these areas in purple kind of show how reliant they are. So northern Contra Costa, 100% reliant on the delta. If it failed in some way, they'd be out of water except what they have stored in their reservoirs. Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, about 40%. Livermore, that area, about 80% of their water from the delta. And of course, in the agricultural areas, anywhere from 1/4 to 3/4 or more of all their water going into, from the delta going into agricultural production. And the source of most of the fruit and vegetables for the United States during much of the year. Finally, Southern California, about 1/3 of their water comes from the delta. Of course, they have other sources like the Colorado River, the Owens Valley. Those have their problems as well. So the delta is a critical part of California's economy. And should it not be there for some reason, we'd have some very serious problems, which we're going to have. So here's the delta in its perspective as the number of feet above or below sea level. And in the delta, due to the fact that the farmers have developed it very intensively, took away a lot of the biological resources that Peter talked about, and in fact developed agriculture on virtually all the islands, and then began to farm it intensively with heavy equipment, burning the delta, and it oxidized because it's peat soils. These blue areas are below sea level. And while it says at the bottom here, in the area of 15 feet, a lot of these areas are 25 feet below sea level now and still going down. These agricultural practices haven't changed that much, and so the peat soils are being further and further depleted. You can have the remarkable experience of standing on a delta island, especially in the central delta here, and looking up about as high as this ceiling and seeing an ocean-going ship go by up there, and you're down here. Is that how you want to have your water supply? And frankly, it's a risky business. Now, each delta island, everything in this blue area has failed at least once. Some of these islands have failed 6 or 7 times over their history. We haven't had a failure recently, well, fairly recently, and we almost lost Tyler Island during this latest high water event, but we have a long history of losing these islands. What happens? Well, if all kinds of water, like today, I was just up in Sacramento, is coming down the Sacramento River, it's fine, it'll keep out, the bay. But if an island fails during the summer, some of you may remember 1974, Brannan and Andros Island failed in the middle of June on a perfectly clear, low water day, probably because of a gopher going into the hole in the levee, who knows. Bad things happen. Uh-oh, keep forgetting. So here's the delta, and this is just one scenario, there are a lot of other ones. Here's the delta, and an earthquake just happened. Now there are faults running right underneath the delta, the Green Valley Fault, a number of other faults running into the delta. So a 6.5 in or near the delta is not an unlikely scenario. It's a virtual certainty with regard to the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, which are pretty nearby. So the earthquake happens. These islands, as I mentioned, are mostly peat. The levees were mostly built by Chinese labor in the early 1900s. You can imagine the engineering standards that went into those, not. And so the levees will liquefy. They'll liquefy the same way it did in the marina area in San Francisco during the last earthquake. And what happens? Salt water begins to come in. Remember, this is sea level. This is actually sea level. And so the minute these islands fail, they begin to fill up. Remember that slide that John showed you of the Yolo bypass with the water rushing in? That's what happens when the levee fails. These holes in the delta, as Jeff Mount calls them, anthropogenic holes. These holes fill up. As soon as the levee fails, they begin to fill up, and nothing can stop them once they start filling up. And to fill those holes, the ocean comes in. And the ocean comes in a very bad way. So that here we are, down in the southern delta, trying to meet all those water needs that I showed you in the beginning, sort of in that purple slide, and we can't do it anymore. It's over. You cannot pump from the delta. In 1972 or 74, when Andros and Brannan failed, they had to stop pumping, and finally it lasted so long that they had to what they call eat the salt. They had to dump a bunch of water out of the reservoirs, kind of dilute it as much as they could, and then pump it south, and it was very bad quality. But in this scenario, it's just not going to happen anymore. There will be no more exports from the delta. 20% of California's water supply comes from the delta, and it's subject to catastrophic failure of a kind that we have not experienced in our lifetimes in any of our water supplies in California. We've never had that. And it would have devastating consequences. I think Peter rightly pointed out, economists sometimes overestimate the impact of water shortages. But a 20% cutoff, and in areas like Livermore, an 80% cutoff, or Contra Costa County, 100% cutoff, that is going to have some serious consequences. So what do the tunnels do? What's the point of the tunnels? I'm not going to go into the possible environmental benefits. I appreciate John covering them. They are actually somewhat there. But the tunnels are really not about saving the environment. The tunnels are an insurance policy against catastrophic failure in the Delta. They would indeed divert water up from the Sacramento River, and some of it at least could still go down here. Not as much as we take today. That would be impossible. We take a lot of water today. We're never going to get that supply back if the Delta fails. But maybe 60% or so, it's better than nothing. Now, the earthquake scenario is one that's tomorrow, 2153. Who knows when an earthquake comes? But some of you have probably heard of something called climate change. I'm sure it's come up in some of your discussions. And the Delta levees are person-made. They have to be maintained, and you're constantly struggling to keep them up. And we've spent hundreds and hundreds of your tax dollars giving presents to the owners of these private Delta islands to keep up their levees, and we continue to do that. But no one can imagine that these levees will still be around when the sea level rise is 3 feet, maybe 3 feet. So if we have a 1 meter rise in the sea level, the Delta is gone. It's a historical, interesting geological feature they'll teach about in textbooks and in classes for many years, but it will be an inland sea. And if you can do the right kind of searching on the USGS website, you'll find something called Sacramento Bay. That's Sacramento Bay. And if you live over here in the pocket area in Sacramento, you'll have oceanfront property. And so the tunnels are really not about saving the environment. There is a benefit, as John pointed out, and I would agree with that. The tunnels are about getting ready for an inevitable change in the geology of California. The conversion of the Sacramento Delta to an inland sea. Will that be good for fish? Will it be bad for fish? It's really hard to say. Peter Meral is the preeminent expert on fish in California, I would say. When I've asked him this question, he says, who knows? These fish evolved, some of them in the Delta, but on the other hand, salmon undoubtedly swam through the Delta when it was just a river, 10,000 years ago. They've been around a lot longer than that. So we don't know the impacts on fish, but we do know it's going to happen. Exactly when? When will the sea level rise be 3 feet? Will it be 2050, 2070, 2040? Some people think. Who knows? It's quite close. And there is no way to stop it, and there's no way to keep those levees up. You cannot accommodate a 3-foot sea level rise in the Delta by building up the levees. It would cost roughly the state budget. And even then, it probably wouldn't work because the levees are underlain with peat soils, and so the more you pile on them, the more they sink. And so it's not like building a wall in your garden where you get a pretty good base. You've got nothing underneath to really hold them up. You can do it. You can build them up and build them up, but 3 feet, no one can imagine that we can afford that. So I think my pitch would be, as citizens of the state, with the understanding that we have climate change as an inevitability and the sea level rise that goes along with it, we've simply got to accommodate that and be prepared for it. And not to be prepared for it because of rivalries between Northern and Southern California would be irresponsible, especially considering the people most reliant on the Delta for water supply are us, the Bay Area. Alameda, Contra Costa, Santa Clara counties, these counties are critically reliant on Delta water and have no substitutes. If you want to give up that Delta supply, you're going to have to accommodate some very serious, large desalting plants around the bay and in the ocean because there simply is no other available source of supply to replace it. Now, is it all doom and gloom so far as the habitat in the Delta? No. It is possible in the shallower islands, not the real deeply subsided ones, to grow new habitat, to grow tules, to try to keep up with sea level rise and keep the level of the islands, advancing as the sea level gets deeper and deeper. That is possible. There's 2 programs the state has. One is Delta Fix, which is the tunnels, and the other one is Ecosystem Restore. And on that little table back there, there's one little fact sheet in each one of them, and you're welcome to take one. If you find they're all gone, let me know, and I'll be around and I can get you one. So I think we have to realize that climate change is real and the effects of climate change are real. Here in the Bay Area, BCDC is like, we get it. We're going to try to figure out a way to accommodate that. In the Delta, many people have blinders on. The Delta farmers first and foremost. A lot of the water agencies don't want to really believe that's going to happen. And frankly, some of my colleagues in the environmental movement would like to see the Delta stay as it is. That would be nice. That is not going to happen. So we've got to be ready for it, and that's why we have this tunnels project. Thank you.
The next intermediate question is for Dr. Meral. Yes, can't see her. Go ahead.
So what is the purpose of the tunnels?
The tunnels will allow the continued export of some water from the Sacramento River to the state and federal pumps in the South Delta. If the Delta goes underneath and it's all salt water, all that's cut off.
How does the water come from Foster County?
It comes right out of they have their own pumps in the South Delta, and they also get water from the federal pumps. And so they would now get water from the tunnels as opposed to where they do it now. By the way, just to point out, there is one agency in the Bay Area that's pretty aware of this and sort of is dealing with it by accident. The East Bay Municipal Utility District built their own peripheral canal, that's what we used to call it, years ago by building a new intake up on the Sacramento River right near where the tunnels would come out, so they would be protected. But they're not reliant on the Delta for export, oddly enough. They use the McKelvey.
Did you have a follow-up behind you? Yes. Sure.
Can you explain the oxidation cycle? Why that soil, that peat soil just disappears?
Can you repeat
Yeah, the question is, why does the peat soils in the Delta oxidize? They are organic. And in the old days, when things were really out of control in the Delta, if you dropped a lighted match on some of those islands, they would burn. And if you think about how they, keep their houses warm in Ireland, peat is what they're using to burn. That's what these soils are. They're so light, if you throw them into the air, they'll blow away. It isn't like regular dirt. And those peat soils make up most of the central Delta islands, and they can be 60 feet deep. That's why they're so subsided below sea level.
Any other immediate questions? Last comment? Yes, ma'am.
Just one question. If I understand the need for the water, would it be possible, instead of doing the tunnels, that some of the Hetch or the other reservoirs, would that be enough water to accommodate the areas that you're speaking of, the 100% need from the Delta?
Only to a very minor extent. San Francisco, and Peter really explained it well, San Francisco serves not just themselves, but San Mateo County and a large part of Santa Clara County, and even some of Alameda County. So they're pretty stretched. I mean, they might be able to serve a little bit more, and they did serve us here in Marin during the drought. We got Hetch water. But in terms of making up the 5 million acre feet that are pumped out of the Delta each year on average now, which is about what it is, they couldn't even begin to accommodate that, even in the Bay Area. It's way too much. A little bit, but not very much at all.
One other question, yes, sir.
I think you said something about the capacity of the tunnels, proposed tunnels, compared to the amount of water that's currently being pumped at pumping stations. Could you say again what you said?
Yeah. Right. The question is why are the tunnels so big? The tunnels have a capacity of 9,000 cubic feet per second, which is pretty good flow. I mean, the Sacramento River today is flowing probably 50,000, but 9,000 is still quite a good flow. That's because the Sacramento River, like everything else in the West, is flashy. It goes way up in the spring, especially in the winter and the spring. You get the spring runoff, you get the storms in the winter, it goes way up, and then it drops way down, so the natural flow in the summer is next to nothing. And if you don't build it fairly large, you can't capture those big flows, and then you've got nothing left over. Oddly enough, the California Aqueduct, which is 10,000 cubic feet per second, was sized that way because legislators from Contra Costa County, the heart of the opposition to the tunnels, George Miller Sr., our former congressman's father, was in the state senate, and he said, that is going to be a 10,000 cubic feet per second aqueduct, so you can pump like crazy during the winter and back off in the summer. And so the idea, the more you downsize, the less your ability to take those big flows when you have them available.
Good question, and a lot now for us to be balancing. Thank you very much, Dr. Meral. Greg, would you come up, please? Our final speaker, Greg Reese, is a scientist with the Bay Institute's Rivers and Delta program. His work supports the protection and restoration of aquatic ecosystems from the Sierra to the sea. He got his BS from Cal Poly in forestry and natural resources with a concentration in environmental management, has been working in the area ever since. Greg, bring it home.
Thank you. My wife was actually a EFM graduate about 20 years ago. So, oh, sorry. My wife, can you hear me now? My wife was an EFM graduate about 20 years ago, and is anyone else from San Geronimo Valley or Points West? Not tonight, except nice drive through Lucas Valley. So I'm honored to be here, and I really appreciate EFM's work. So the Bay Institute, our mission is to protect, restore, and inspire the conservation of San Francisco Bay from the Sierra to the sea. And we focus on aquatic ecosystems and Central Valley water management. Much of my talk will come from a new report we came out with in the fall called San Francisco Bay, the Freshwater Starved Estuary. And if somebody wants to take this home with you, if you promise to donate it to the Marin County Library, I will let you take this. So, and as a bonus, we're doing frequent updates on water conditions. I've included our latest one in here. So just let me know if you want that later. I won't be covering all my slides. The previous speakers did excellent jobs covering a lot of the material, and so I even have some of the same slides as Peter. So I'll be skipping through some of them. Hopefully that won't be too distracting. I'm going to focus mainly on the benefits of the freshwater flow to the bay. And this is something, San Francisco Bay is an estuary, and an estuary is a place where freshwater and saltwater mix. It is very productive habitat and many unique species. It's an amazing ecosystem. Everybody knows California is an amazing place, and this is no exception. The freshwater and saltwater dynamic, it shifts with the freshwater inflow. In the summer, the saltwater moves in the winter, the saltwater moves out. The fish move with it, and there's migrations going through it. It's just really an incredible place, and all of our responsibility to protect. So I won't spend much time on here, but the point of this one is just to get across that the salinity does shift in different years as well. So during dry years and wet years, you're going to have a different salinity gradient in the estuary. And then the different fish are adapted to different parts of the estuary. Some fish like the fresher water, like the Delta smelt. Other fish will like the saltier water, like the starry flounder. And longfin smelt will be a little more cosmopolitan, but they definitely they're one of the most dependent, they are the most dependent fish correlated with freshwater inflows because they need that for reproduction. Most problems are caused by solutions. California has about 1,400 dams that are over about 10 feet high. And each one of those dams was solving a problem. But in addition to that solution, it caused problems. So we're dealing with that legacy. But the point here is we've pretty much created permanent drought by storing and diverting so much water. We have an incredible capacity to store water in California. I think we can store 50 million acre feet in our reservoirs. That's just an amazing amount of water. There are proponents for building even more dams, and most of those are extremely expensive and don't provide much water and cause even more environmental problems. So I'd be very wary of any solutions to our problems that are more the same, that use the same old solutions to try to solve the problems those previous solutions caused. And the twin tunnels, I would agree, would fall into that category. So this water management has impacted the estuary. A lot of species are in severe decline. We have a lot of endangered species. This permanent drought that our water management has caused is shown in this slide. The top panel shows unimpaired flow, which is flow it's an index of natural runoff. It's not natural, but it's an index of the water available in the watershed that without dams or diversions would run off and flow into the bay. So this would be the delta outflow or the bay inflow on the top, unimpaired. So California has widely varying hydrology from year to year. And on the bottom panel is the actual flow. We've sorted all the years since 1930 into bins of 20%, so quintiles. And we've called wet is the wettest 20% of years, then above normal, below normal, dry, and critical dry are the driest 20%, with the driest year, 1977, being super critical. So we applied the same bins to the actual flows to the bay, and you can see what we've done is we've made almost half the years drier than the driest year on record. So it's a permanent drought. If you'll notice, the last above normal year was in 1986, so we've almost eliminated the above normal years. A year like 2017 is going to be up here, so we can't hold back the wet ones, but all the other ones were really severely truncating and taking that freshwater flow out of the system, and that is impacting the bay. May is the worst month. This is a similar graph, but it's shown as the median unimpaired year is 0, and then the divergence from that. And you can see the unimpaired in the top panel, in the bottom panel, we just don't even get above median very often anymore in that month. And many other months are equally bad, or not equally. May is the worst, but almost as bad. So the ecosystem is dependent on these freshwater flows because of all the processes that it drives. There's the salinity, turbidity, there's a lot more than that, but those would come to mind as the two biggest ones. And then the food web, plankton will be generated from that. Then you get the bigger fish and bigger fish dependent on that. And so it really drives everything. Right now, a lot of that, with all the flood flows, is going on out in the Gulf of the Farallones. And I don't know if any of you get Point Blue's emails, but I just got their email, and they talked about this very thing going on out in the Gulf of the Farallones right now. So it does shift around depending on how wet it is. So the species that are in decline are many of these, and you'll see that these have different things. One thing in common is they're all correlated with freshwater flow, but they're very diverse, and some are native and non-native. Some live 1 year, like delta smelt. Some live decades, like sturgeon. You got anadromous fish, resident fish, migratory fish. You got them reproducing in rivers, in the delta, or in the ocean, or the estuary. So these are all very diverse life history strategies, but these all depend on freshwater flow. And so across all those trophic levels, you're getting a collapse. It's just a consistent decline in the fisheries that depend on that flow. And delta smelt, as we know, is almost went extinct in this drought. It's barely hanging on. Longfin smelt, pretty bad. Winter run Chinook, we heard John talk about the mismanagement in 2014 and 15 upstream. The delta tunnels, the twin tunnels, I believe there was just a review of the biological opinions for it in January, and they were pretty critical of it. The fishery agencies were talking about winter run declines due to changes in management upstream, due to warmer temperatures in the river. At the tunnels themselves at the intake, I think 5 to 10% loss. And then in the downstream, where the water is diverted from the Sacramento River, lower flows in the Sacramento River, additional loss. So an endangered species is not going to be helped out with this project. Delta smelt, I think the biological opinion was pretty critical. there too, saying it was not going to help them, and they really need some help right now. And we don't need one more project that's going to send them under. So, let's see. So I'm going to skip through some more. So the status quo is unacceptable. That is correct. Right now, there's about 9 million fish a year being salvaged at the pumps. And those are salvaged. So all the ones that are eaten by the predators John was talking about are not in this count. So much more than 9 million fish are being impacted by the current way we do things. The question is, will this project make it better? And the answer is no. The south pumps will continue to be operated under this project. Not necessarily at the same levels at all the time, but a lot of the time they will be. And then we're adding a new source of problems at the Sacramento River, where currently, the Delta smelt can go in that direction and be okay. The salmon can go in that direction and be okay. And we're just sending the problem that way. So there is a problem, but this project is not the answer. And if it was proposed differently and designed differently, maybe it'd be an okay project. I think a lot of environmental groups have wanted to support it, and we went along with a lot of the planning, trying to shape it, trying to direct it in the right direction, and it just didn't make it. It didn't get in the right direction. So as is proposed, it's not a good project. The sediment, I just want to mention the tidal marshes, just like the Delta Islands have restoration needs and problems needing sediment to fill in some of those holes. The tidal marshes in the bay need a lot of sediment to come down the rivers. The freshwater flow brings that sediment. When you divert it, you divert the sediment, you prevent it from moving in the river. And even beaches out south of the Golden Gate down to Pacifica, the sand from those beaches came from the Sierra. It's Sierra granite. And that sand is moved by freshwater flows. So the sediment is a really important piece of this. And this is something I put together just from this year's storms, where you can see the sediment plume going out the Golden Gate. And in a year like this, it's a great way to show it, but it is a process that happens in drier years too. And well, I was hoping it wasn't a repeat, but you get the idea. Yeah. And I mentioned the freshwater flow updates we're doing. We're trying to update this often. This is this year, and you can see you can see in this upper panel, before the reservoirs filled, we were capturing 82% of the peak flow, 58%, 43%, 49%, and then the reservoirs started filling. And then they were doing flood control releases in here. So the Stanislaus River, where you have huge storage compared to the flow of the river, way overbuilt, we have pretty much the peaks aren't getting through yet. That reservoir is not full yet. And where there's proposals for building even more dams and more diversions, we're going to turn this graph more into one like this with every increment of water we're taking out of the system. These are, let's see, exports up here, just showing this year we've got the storage change in black and exports in blue. And so storage change combined with exports this year has been the highest since at least this decade. And I just threw in the Feather River just for popular interest, since a lot's been going on there where they shut down for the spillway there. But you can see on the Feather, it was pretty bad. They were storing water in Oroville, 96% of the peaks, 97%, 81% captured. And then when this happened, it filled up and they spilled it. Yeah, our rivers, some of our rivers are in really bad shape. And you hear a lot about complaints about the endangered species stopping exports. It's really very minimal, 3.3% of the Central Valley runoff, and we have a paper coming out with the Nature Conservancy soon on that. So here's my concluding slides. The biggest problem is new infrastructure is going to create dependency and expectations, and we've seen this over and over again in California's history. It's a process we keep seeing. Agreements and insurances are made. We're going to build this, but we're going to take care of the ecosystem. So, especially with high-capacity projects with low water rights, because the people that want that water can't go after the other people with water rights, they go after the ecosystem because it's an easier target to get more water. So these projects are dangerous. They get assurances. Everybody says, okay, that sounds good. And then you operate it, and you operate it based on modeling, and you know, it's an experiment. Initial protections are based on projections, and political considerations, naturally. And often you need to enhance your protections while you're operating it. You realize we were wrong, we gotta change things, and that's hard to do. It's hard to take water away from people. And then, even if you do have good protections already, this we see over and over again. Political and legal pressure is applied to change or bend the rules. And I have some examples. I'll try to go through quickly. Westland's advocates told Congress in the 1950s that the San Luis unit was only a supplemental supply, and there would be many years when they would take basically nothing from the Delta. Well, I think many of us know Westlands is always litigating and lobbying for more water. And you know, that's just devastating when they win. State Water Project was to only export water in excess of the needs of the Delta. Well, we know record exports have been occurring. 2011, record State Water Project exports and combined Central Valley Project. And the ecosystem has been declining. The Delta Mendota Water Authority and Westlands also acknowledged that by voluntarily agreeing to the Delta Accords, they would never receive more than 60 to 70% of deliveries. Last week, the Bureau of Reclamation announced that they weren't releasing the allocations this year because they're going to wait and see. And you heard people up in arms, overreacting and indignant that it wasn't 100% supply this year. It's such a wet year. And so they apply the political pressure, and they get the press to say, well, why isn't it 100%? It's a wet year. Well, it's because it's never going to be more than 60 to 70% if you want to protect the ecosystem. And then the Decision 1641 in the Water Quality Control Plan during the drought, the Water Board repeatedly, I think I counted 21 times they made orders weakening the Water Quality Control Plan during the drought. And then most recently, the Endangered Species Act and the Feinstein Bill last fall, which it was an attempt pretty much to bend the rules as far as they could, and hopefully they don't break. But anyway, that makes the point, I think, the Cal Water fix falls short. Twin tunnels and Sites Reservoir and other proposed reservoirs may be enticing as potential solutions to some environmental problems. However, it would be following a similar course. Lots of promises for ecosystem protection up front, but the high capacities, low water rights, and powerful and politically active beneficiaries of the projects would likely result in continual pressure to ease protections and then ongoing conflict as a result. The path forward for these projects is honest, forward-thinking analyses that result in strong guarantees for ecosystem protection, shared goals between the project beneficiaries, regulators, non-governmental organizations, and independent scientific oversight of real adaptive management. And I should mention, I also work for the Mona Lake Committee, and I think we have a good model there. I've worked for them for 20 years on watershed restoration, and the Water Board has independent scientists running the restoration program. And I think we have good examples in the Bay Delta too, the Delta Science Program. So anyway, I think I went over my time, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the other speakers to come up, and one or two questions for Greg. One there, sir.
You mentioned the modeling. Is the modeling accurate? And I assume what the modeling does is, under different scenarios, you operate differently. Or is the operation not what the model said because of all the legal and political pressure that changed?
So the question was pretty much how good is the modeling for the twin tunnels. The modeling, it depends. They did a pretty good job on some of it. There have been a lot of critiques on other models. It gets pretty complicated, but overall, there were some big problems with it. It doesn't mean it's worthless and you throw it all out, but it does mean that you can't rely on it. You can't rely on it for a lot of the conclusions. The models, Calcim 2 comes to mind as one of the big models they used. It manages the reservoirs not according to the rules in some cases, and so there's flaws. Part of the problem with the BDCP documents that we commented on many times were sometimes the technical analyses were good, but then in the document you'd get the conclusions that it looked like somebody else wrote, which would often come to a different conclusion than the technical analyses. So it seemed like it was almost a PR job. So we were very disappointed with the modeling in some ways, but it was a mix depending on the models you're talking about. Yeah, so the question is, what's the solution? In my career, I always wondered if I ever would work on the Delta, and I was always a little worried that I might, because it's a big problem. I'm not sure we have an easy solution. I'm sure we don't. A lot of the environmental groups did propose a portfolio alternative maybe 2-3 years ago, and it was a combination of south of Delta storage and smaller tunnels. Conservation, water recycling, efficiency. So it was just a portfolio of other alternatives that could deal with the water supply end of things. Regarding the earthquakes, if you built the twin tunnels, it's not going to solve the earthquake problem. The delta will still collapse in an earthquake. So that's something. We need some other solution to that problem. And the reverse flows, I think, I'm probably not the expert on this. I've been working on this for about 4 or 5 years, and I think it'll take a lifetime to do that.
There was a woman in the back here who has a question. Go.
One is, given the current political climate and the fact that a lot of money is probably not going to come to California, how feasible is a big project like twin tunnels? And then the second one is, wasn't there something like a peripheral canal that was supposed to alleviate the problem, and whatever happened to that?
I might start on that. The proposal for the twin tunnels has never relied on federal money. It's all supposed to be paid for by the water users, starting in Alameda County, Santa Clara, the Central Valley, and Southern California. So a lack of federal funding would not affect that. The tunnels replaced the old peripheral canal idea. I had the privilege of being the spokesperson for the peripheral canal back in the 70s, 80s, and in our county here, there was a public vote of the peripheral canal. It was in 1982, June of 1982, and we all here in Marin voted the way they kind of did in sort of communist Romania. The vote was 97-3 against the peripheral canal in Marin County, the highest vote, and I'm sure in my precinct in Inverness, nobody voted for it at all. But that was a vote against sending water to Southern California, really, the same way they did in 1960 when the State Water Project was proposed. But we have to realize this is not, Southern California begins in Antioch, and so it's us in the Bay Area that are relying on the Delta.
And does anybody want to address the same question, and then she got the other question of.
Is this thing working?
Yep.
Check test. Okay. If I can add just a few words to that, you asked about how economically feasible this would be. In December, just this past December, a new federal law came into existence, which basically calls for weakening protections for the environment in order to allow more pumping. This came about as a result of work of Senator Dianne Feinstein with Kevin McCarthy, the House Majority Whip, who comes from Bakersfield. Well, if you're the water users and you're south of the Delta, and you're getting right now 3 to 5 million acre feet of water, and all of a sudden you have hope you're going to get more because of this new federal law, do you have the inclination to pony up the $30 billion, $40, $50 billion by the time the debt is serviced to get about the same amount of water? I have to imagine they're asking themselves this question right now.
Okay, I'm going to ask folks who have questions to come up here because we are still taping, and it's going to be much better for questions to be heard to come from right here. But as people come up, first, do members of the panel have questions of one another or pushback on one another? Because obviously there's some divergence of views on the particular issue of the twin tunnels.
Well, I'll ask everyone their opinions on, there's an idea floated instead of having twin tunnels to have one tunnel. And I'm wondering if anyone's excited about that or who's excited about it?
So I mentioned that portfolio alternative, which I believe was the smaller tunnel. My last slides are the caveat, though. How can you, and John said, can you trust those guys? How can you trust those are going to be used responsibly? If you build the infrastructure smaller, then you certainly have that built into it. So that is an advantage of a smaller tunnel. So I'd say that if it was proposed in the right way, I think we would probably support it.
So some of you may have noticed this little slight problem up in Orville Dam, and it's not a bad idea to have redundancy. You notice that when the spillway failed, they had the emergency spillway, which Ron Stork at Friends of the River rightly pointed out wasn't built right, but nevertheless could have operated in a way to protect the dam. The tunnels, the idea of having two is redundancy. If one fails for some reason, or the pumps in them fail or whatever, you've got another one. But fundamentally, it was probably a mistake to reduce them from the 15,000 cubic feet per second size of the old peripheral canal down to 9,000, which is what they're at now. And what the NRDC proposal was to reduce it down to 3,000. All that does is force you to take more and more water during the critical periods for the fish, which are the low flow periods. You'll want to take the water when it's high. You don't want to take it when it's low. The more you reduce the capacity, the more you force the exports into the most critical season.
Thank you. It seems the proverbial whale in the room is sea level rise. And Jerry, you addressed it. 3 feet is what we hope for. 6 and 7 is what the new science is starting to say. And historical records about flows and fish and this and that, well, it ain't going to happen anymore. So what are we talking about here? Is this a mitigation plan for climate protection? Or are we talking about a new inland sea?
So I think a lot of our proposals and management are based on the status quo. In California especially, where you have CEQA and other laws, really making it hard to diverge from the status quo. And so I think that frames our thinking where things come from. But I agree. I think, well, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, we're looking at 200 feet. And we should probably start planning for that, I would say. Because so far, things aren't looking good. We probably have some time, we have 100 or 2 years, 200 years maybe for that. So the question is time and planning, and I totally agree. Instead of spending money on projects like this and some of these new reservoirs that are extremely expensive, spend the money on solutions that are actually going to deal with this. Move, instead of the tunnel intake at just south of Sacramento, move it up farther. And sure, it's going to be more expensive, but make things able to deal with these long-term possibilities. If you're going to be spending a lot of money, you want to deal with all the contingencies.
I would just add that, what the speaker said, the person who asked the question, was correct, except it's probably worse than that. I mean, there are plenty of credible projections showing 3 meters at the end of this century. That's perfectly within the realm of possibility. So 9, 10 feet. And the way to deal with that from the ecological point of view is to aggressively protect the uplands, because the areas around the Jepson Prairie in Solano County or even up toward Vacaville, that's going to be the new beachfront. And we've got to make sure those areas are not developed, because they will be the tidal marshes that will go to replace the Suisun Marsh that will be under so much water it probably won't be brackish anymore. So we've got it all the way around the delta, way up into San Joaquin County, way down below Tracy in San Joaquin. We've got to protect those areas, because those will be the marshlands that we'll expect to act as the nursery habitat for the salmon that John was discussing in the Yolo Bypass. A lot of the Yolo Bypass will be too far under to serve that purpose. But we do have undeveloped lands all around the periphery of the delta that have got to be aggressively protected to make sure we still have the nurseries for the young fish.
I try to make a point to always mention the role of population growth in every environmental issue, and I think we really need to get serious about talking about, can we keep on growing? Twice as many people, twice as many greenhouse gases, twice as many people living in the areas where they might have to move. So, to me, if someone had a choice of maybe having a slightly smaller family or giving up a lot of resources that they use, it's kind of an easy choice. We haven't really been forced to do that, but the population of the planet has doubled in my lifetime. I believe in California, it's pretty much doubled in my lifetime. That's pretty fast.
I just want to add just a couple of other footnotes. Jerry's talking about 9,000 cubic feet per second with 3 intakes. Originally, the plan called for 5. We all squawked, saying they're going to basically drain the Sacramento dry. Their side backed down to 3. At the time it was 5, they described 15,000 cubic feet per second that would be taken from the Sacramento River. Now it's down to 9,000. Well, note, the constraining factor here is the intakes, not those doggone pipes. So if you want to talk about a couple of 10-foot diameter pipes, maybe 20-foot, maybe we could have a discussion, but you probably get the idea. We're a little nervous about the size of the thing. I understand. Listen, that shot I showed you of the Yolo Bypass, there was 200,000 cubic feet per second of water flowing into the Yolo Bypass when that picture was taken. It's a lot of water. You can see why they'd want to have gigantic facilities to grab it. I get it. We get it. If we could trust their hand on the valve, we'd say go for it. But we demonstrated, I think, why we're reticent.
Next question.
Well, I'm a San Franciscan, so I'll talk from that perspective. First question John touched on, and that is, San Francisco Bay is already suffering predominantly from a loss of flows. We've lost 50% of our flows since the big pump started. The intakes are above the delta, so any water taken into the tunnels will not come to San Francisco Bay, exacerbating that problem. Whether it's 9,000 now or 15,000 cubic feet per second at the tunnel's capacity, it still would be incredibly damaging from the point of view of San Francisco Bay, from people who live in San Francisco and around the bay. Second question is, I've been reading about the engineering of the tunnels themselves. Recent engineering studies suggest that they will not withstand, the tunnels themselves would very likely collapse in a moderate earthquake. The delta isn't particularly prone to earthquakes, but that's another critique that I don't think has come out and has sort of emerged lately. And my final point for you to just mull over and react to is that I know in other parts of the world, South Florida, for example, the conclusion is being reached that the best way to counter sea level rise is to increase flows from your rivers. It's the fresh water pushing back against the sea level that counters that. in addition to the fact that it's the freshwaters that bring down the nutrients and sediment, it's the sediment that builds up your wetlands as sea level rises. So I guess I'm posing my question as comments, but it's for you to react to. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was quite a list. First of all, we're not talking about a new project here, folks. There is the capacity in the southern part of the delta to divert 15,000 cubic feet per second today in the existing pumps. And so the idea that somehow this is going to increase the capacity to divert from the delta, no, it's actually much less than the current capacity. You can't increase the capacity more than the canals can carry away from the delta. And that's today 15,000 cubic feet per second. 10,000 in the state project, 5,000 in the federal project. Will an earthquake collapse the tunnels? Well, San Francisco just completed building a similar tunnel right underneath San Francisco Bay, virtually next to the San Andreas Fault. And I didn't hear anyone say that that size tunnel, which is not that different from what is being proposed in the Delta, isn't going to work, that it's going to collapse. It is not going to collapse. Engineers today can build things to withstand earthquakes. Not everything can withstand an earthquake, but a tunnel certainly can. On the question of sediment coming into the bay, the historic source of sediment, Bay Institute's been helpful in pointing this out, was the mining debris coming out of the Yuba and Feather Rivers and the American River and so on. And when you look at Highway 37 and look south from Highway 37, you see all those sort of nice-looking wetlands. Well, actually, those were built up on mining debris that has now ceased flowing from the Sierra. We've finally gotten 100 years later, more than 100 years later, we've gotten over that flow of sediment. So the bay is now a sediment-starved system, and we want more sediment in the bay, actually, to replace what was coming out of the mining debris. Finally, the question of, can we use fresh water to push back against the sea? Well, the flow at the Golden Gate as the tide flows in and out is 3 million cubic feet per second. And no river on this planet could withstand that kind of flow. The Mississippi average flow is 1 million cubic feet per second. Even the whole Mississippi River couldn't fight the flow of just the tide flowing in and out of the bay. That when the sea wants to come in, it's going to come in, and all the rivers in the world can't stop it. So that's not really a solution for us.
More questions? Actually, can I respond to that last question? Part of the question was, what do we do about the trickle of water that's left over after these new intakes are turned on, if they are built? And I would just like to flag that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service have been asked to look at this very question. And they published some preliminary results that say it'll be bad news. Basically, what's left over downstream of the intakes won't be enough to keep the system healthy as it is today. Now, in the future scenario that Jerry's pointing out, it's a new day. It's a whole new game. But part of the consideration here is we also need to build this thing so it works in today's world, because we don't know when we're going to see the failure in the future that Jerry talks about.
Okay. First, I want to thank all of you. Your presentations were very interesting and very informative. I feel like I've learned a lot on every side. And I want to respond to something you said, Greg, about a way of thinking that is not the old way of thinking. That seems to be happening everywhere in our species right now. We need to do that, even as we drive here and see a new lane going on 101, and we're thinking, okay, by the time they finish it, it's going to be 3 lanes too narrow. Like, we need to think ahead more, and the way you said that really spoke to me. But at the same time, I think it is important to take the wisdom of the ancient peoples who have lived on the earth for so long and so well, and who really know how to survive. And for example, the Winnemem-Wintu tribe, who have lived for 5,000 years at the headwaters of the Sacramento River, have a very, although not scientific, but a very wise understanding of how systems work and how to create solutions that don't cause problems. And I'm wondering if they have been invited to any of these discussions. And I came here actually partially, please don't fail me now, phone, because the chief of the Winnemem-Wintu tribe sent this, and I just wanted to read it. It's very short. While I wait for this to work, I want to ask you, John, if you are aware that the Winnemem-Wintu have a very viable, well-thought-out plan of how to bring the Chinook salmon back to the McLeod River. So that's kind of a personal question, but if you don't know, I'd love to put you in contact with them. Here's the message.
It's an easy answer. Actually, Kayleen Sisk, who is their chief, sits on our board, and we are in touch.
Oh, great. So she asked that this be read in reference to this event. This is a priority. Please go to this event on the Twin Tunnels. Please make it known that the Winnemem-Wintu tribe opposes this because of damage to sacred sites and harm to wild Chinook salmon and Delta smelt. Also make an issue of the cost of this and the lack of notice to the tribes. Where is section 106? So I read that on her behalf, and thank you very much.
I've had the privilege of meeting with Colleen, the chief of the Winnemem-Wintu, several times, including 3 times up on her reservation at the McLeod, and they are very dedicated to preserving and restoring the salmon in the McLeod. It's terribly difficult because the Shasta Dam blocks the Sacramento River in the McLeod, and so the question is how to get the fish up above the dam and get the babies back down. But they are dedicated to that, and I applaud them for it.
Yeah, I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Actually, one more thought about salmon that made me think of a hopeful message, actually, that it would be nice, is that salmon can really respond well to good conditions. It's amazing. There's a doubling goal where it's the law that salmon are in Central Valley must double. And some people look at that and say, well, how can that be? How can that be possible? But after wet years, the populations really go up. They have a high reproductive capacity. And so even though we have these incredibly low populations, if we manage things right, the populations can really increase rapidly.
From years now, folks have been, Will Durst, I think, was talking about it on the radio all the time, advertising about, I think it's now called the California Fix, the threat of an earthquake in the Delta and the levees failing. And water rushing in to fill up an island. It seems to me that's a temporary issue. I mean, devastating, of course, especially to the people who are living or doing farming on this island. But once it's full, I mean, just the flow in stops, does it not? I mean, it's full, the water's filled. We go back to the stasis we had before. Or have I missed something here?
Well, once it's full, all the islands fill up with salt water, then you've got salt water in the Delta. And until you have a monumental flow of fresh water coming down in a year like this, it's going to stay salty because the tide keeps going in, coming out, going in. It keeps the whole Delta salty. And so you're in the process of trying to fix dozens of levees, maybe, if it's an earthquake scenario. At the same time, you've still got the salt water in the Delta, and it won't cure until a huge freshwater flow comes down. But I don't think the earthquake scenario, while it's inevitable, is really the problem. The problem is the inevitable sea level rise that no amount of Delta repair is going to fix. It simply overwhelms the existing Delta levees, and that's it. And there's no real engineering solution to that.
Any last words? Anybody going to give me bets on the level of rain next year? The only thing we know for certain with climate change is that it's going to be inconsistent, right?
Yeah, pretty hard to predict. And that's a big part of the problem that, for example, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, they're looking at an 8.5-year drought that we've never seen before. And we might never see, but we don't know. And so they're not part of the solution to the salmon because of the fear. And that's the challenge we're up against. I do want to remind people that the comment deadline for the Bay Delta Plan, which really is our best opportunity to restore the ecosystem, the comment deadline is next Friday, the 17th. And we have a letter writing fact sheet back there. Makes it really easy. 10 minutes, you can crank out a letter and sleep well at night knowing you did your share.
And Go ahead, Jeff.
One last word. Jerry pointed out that the water users are being asked to pay for the Twin Tunnels project. They've basically been the ones to design the thing too. Instead of the fox guarding the hen house, the fox has actually designed the hen house in this instance. If the state had designed it, we might have a project that's already up and running. We might have a project that's already up and running. The one that's been designed has basically been called, or criticized, I should say, by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the U.S. EPA. So again, it could be redesigned, one could imagine theoretically, and I'll just leave it there.
Peter's mention of the water quality control plan reminds me, this is just phase one, the San Joaquin. Phase two is Sacramento and all the other tributaries, and delta outflow, and then flows within the delta. So this project almost is the cart before the horse. Once the water quality control plan is complete and the water board has all the outflow rules set, which are going to greatly increase outflows, we hope, and solve these problems, then you can design a project that can work with that. But right now, they're kind of doing it backwards.
There may be some fact sheets on Delta Fix and on Ecosystem Restore. It's paired project in the back. If not, let me know and I'll get you one.
One of the great things about the Environmental Forum is that it truly acts as a forum that is a marketplace of ideas. I want everybody to, first of all, thank the Gallinas Watershed folks and Dan for bringing this concept together, and these speakers for bringing this meet together. Thank you. Now, you can stay there if you want. Ann has a few more things to say, but don't go away. Dan's got something for you.
For the speakers, that is. But before that happens, and that's, you can stand and watch, but it's not, I mean, we're going to release you. But I want to remind you that this is not the end of the lecture series for the Environmental Forum of Marin. I apologize for the green text up there not showing up very well. But also to note that we have 2 more lectures going on in March. We kind of packed March full. So Saturday, March 18th, Yes We Can, the Marin Solution for Housing. That will be a 3-hour lecture at the same price as this lecture. There will be a planner, an architect, a real estate developer, and you will be working with hearing from them, and also on interactive exercises together with the audience. And so it will be a more interactive rather than a sit and listen forum. And it happens at the Bay Model. It starts at 9, it goes till noon on March 18th. Again, Yes We Can, the Marin Solution for Housing. And it will be all about you thinking about adding sustainable and affordable housing in our communities. The lecture after that is Wednesday, March 22nd. We'll be at the Corte Madera Community Center. And we will be featuring a gentleman, Dr. Zach Brown with the Indian Institute in Alaska. And his topic is a trip north, researching climate and working for change in Alaska. He also just returned from Antarctica, so he's going to be adding a little bit of what he's just saw in Antarctica while he was a naturalist on board the Lindblad expedition ship one of them that just returned. So Dr. Zach Brown on March 22nd at the Corte Madera Community Center in the evening from 7 to 9. And then after that, we have 2 other lectures in April. Wildlife corridors featuring mountain lions and river otters will be back here at the First Presbyterian Church on Wednesday, April 12th from 7 to 9. And our last lecture of the year will be Marin's climate goals and where we stand at the Corte Madera Community Center. And that will be a look at all of our communities and a really great interactive website that those communities have for you to use to see how we are doing on our climate goals and where we stand on our action plans. So that's what we have coming up for the rest of this series.
And yet there's one more. There's, for $29.99, you can get knives too. No, on Monday, May 1st, there's going to be a special session upon the release of the book Project Drawdown. Paul Hawken is going to be speaking about the 100 top ideas for drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. So going beyond what I do as a solar energy person, trying to level down the addition of greenhouse gases, it's actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. That's going to be Monday, May 1st at Dominican in the evening. You can get your reservations for that through Book Passage, because the Forum and Book Passage are collaborating in that, and you get the book with your ticket to get in on Monday, May 1st.
Thank you, David. David was prominent in that event happening, although it's officially not a part of our lecture series, but if you go to our lecture series website, on the website it's there. I want to again thank the speakers. I think it's been a very educational and informative evening. I want to thank the audience for your questions, participating in the forum this evening. Thank you very much. I'm sure if the speakers don't mind, if people want to mingle up here, you're welcome to do that. But thank you very much for your participation tonight.